So today I'll be talking about things that I think that boxing does better than the UFC and things that I think the UFC does better than boxing. So starting out, if you had told me 4 or 5 years ago that boxing would reclaim its throne as the sport that has the big fights that you want happening and the UFC is going to be kind of staggering behind, I wouldn't believe you because boxing was the sport where if you wanted to see the best fight the best, good luck because either you'd have to wait a few years for negotiations and everything to happen, or they just flat out wouldn't happen. Then you had the UFC where Volk was going up a weight class to fight Makachev. You had Pereira coming in and Adesanya versus Pereira. You were having all these big fights happening. But as of 2025, 2026, even maybe a little bit before that, there's been this kind of shift where we're getting Junto Nakatani versus Naoya Inoue later this year. We already got Canelo versus Crawford. We got Bivol Beterbiev not once but twice, and the only reason the third fight hasn't happened is because of Bivol's back injury, right? We got Usyk versus Fury. We got Usyk versus Fury number 2, and now we're waiting on potentially Fury versus Joshua, right? So the big fights keep happening in boxing, and in the UFC, I wouldn't necessarily say that big fights aren't happening. It's just not only has the frequency dropped, but so has the matchmaking in general. So we already know about the John Jones, Tom Aspinall debacle. That was a clear example of the UFC fumbling the bag. We might not be getting to Pirya Makachev. We might eventually, but that was the fight. Like, if the UFC was hyping up the White House, that was the fight to make, and the UFC fumbled that one as well. And again, when it comes to the best fight, the best, Gaethje versus Pimblett was not the best versus the best. It would have been Arman Sarukian versus whoever was maybe a Charles Oliveira in a rematch, or a Max Holloway, or Justin Gaethje, I guess. But Gaethje versus Pimblett was not an example of the best fight the best. And Volkanovski Lopez 2 was another example of the UFC's very strange matchmaking that occurred this year and has been occurring since last year, actually. And overall, the matchmaking of the UFC, I know Brendan Allen just got a fight of his got announced, and he's one of the top like 5, 6 ranked guy in the middleweight division. He's fighting somebody who's not even ranked. And this is just, we had Movsar Evloev versus Lerone Murphy for the number one contendership spot when that should have been Movsar Evloev. Like, we all know he should have been fighting Volkanovski. So it's not like it's very terrible. It's not like matchmaking is completely done. We just got Hamzat Chimaev, Sean Strickland made. And again, the argument could be should have been Imavov, but I'm not against Strickland getting the title shot. Fluffy was being hyped up as like the guy to beat Chimaev, and for Strickland to do what he did, I'm not against it, but it in general, it's been kind of a weird time for the UFC. We're not getting those dream fights. The matchmaking's all over the place, and boxing, weirdly enough, is creating these big fights. You can thank Turkey Al-Sheikh, you can thank whoever you want, but the fact of the matter is that boxing is getting the big fights made, and the UFC really isn't. Now we move on to what the UFC does better than boxing. This is a pretty obvious one. The pacing of the events in the UFC are so much better. In boxing, we get like concerts, and then we get just the amount of time between fights is insane, and we have to listen to an entire panel talk. And the UFC, I would say it's been getting a bit worse lately, especially with the more advertisements and now Paramount. There is a bit more time, but these shows are still so much easier to sit through, a lot less fluff in general. And one thing the UFC still does, and the reason why I prefer a war, a 3 round or a 5 round war over a quick knockout, is because if you've noticed that whenever there's a fight that goes the distance, sometimes the UFC won't even give the guys a mic time because they have to get the other guys in already. I know, I believe it was the Jamal Hill Khalil Roundtree card where they had several fights where they just weren't giving anybody mic time because they had to bring the other guys right in. And so the pacing of the events is just a lot quicker. And I know that's insane to say because some people are already complaining about how many ads there are and how long it takes. But compared to boxing, where we have to sit through panels of people talking, and then we have to go to the crowd and we have to ask a former boxer his opinion, which nobody really, do we really have to hear that? Like, let's just get on to the fight already. So in general, the UFC does have better pacing. Next thing that I'm going to mention, and this is something you can't really disagree with, I think, is that boxing has a lot higher skilled fights. Like, the fighters are a lot higher skilled, and This is not me taking a shot at MMA. Like MMA, obviously the fighters, they got to learn all these different martial arts. Boxing is just boxing. But remember what Demetrius Johnson said: MMA is the easiest sport to become a champion in. And when one of the GOATs is saying that, you ought to listen, because in MMA, it's the one sport where you could have clear holes in your game. We just saw this with Max Holloway, Charles Oliveira, where I picked Holloway to beat Oliveira, but it turns out that he's never really fought a competent grappler before in his career, and he became one of the greats of the sport. And then he got taken down and absolutely held by Oliveira. So in boxing, you don't see that type of holes in a guy's game at the highest level. Ryan Garcia recently had a fight and he looked really good, but you can still see the reasons why Ryan Garcia isn't considered that high level yet, because even though he's a great fighter, amazing hand speed, power, he still makes quite a few defensive mistakes, footwork mistakes, and stuff like that, which kind of keep him from that upper echelon. Whereas in the UFC, nobody can explain to me how Marvin Vettori has fought for a title. How has he ever been a title contender? He has nothing going for him. He has no power, no speed. He's not particularly strong. His striking is no good. He's got an iron chin, and that's about it. And yet he's been a title contender. He beat Paulo Costa, who was also a title contender. We had Movsar Evloev versus Lerone Murphy, which, when the fight was done, if you don't want to take my word for it, you think I'm just spewing nonsense, everybody online was kind of saying the same thing, which was that was a weirdly low-level fight. You know, these are top-level contenders. You watch a Bivol versus Beterbiev, it might not be as exciting, and we'll get to that. But the level that boxers portray in general is so much higher, and one of the big reasons is boxing's in the Olympics, MMA isn't. And so you have a much larger pool of people to pull from. There's going to be a lot more people training for it, a lot more money spent on developing fighters for it, and you're going to have guys like Usyk and guys like Lomachenko who are going to come over into the pro scene and do their stuff there, whereas MMA has a much smaller group of people to pull from in general. And so, guys, MMA is a very young sport. It has not been a thing for longer than like 30 years maybe. Like somewhere in the 90s, UFC as a promotion started, and the first real MMA fight was like Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali, but that wasn't even like MMA. Like, this is a very new sport. When MMA eventually gets added to the Olympics, which I'll probably make a video on why or why not it will or won't happen, maybe we'll see a bigger explosion. But I think we're already seeing a skill gap emerge where guys like Vettori are being swept away by the more talented guys. Ilia Topuria is literally just a really good boxer with good takedown, with good grappling, and nobody has an answer for him. So guys like Ilia Topuria, Islam Makhachev, they're kind of pushing the sport forward, and then you have your JDMs with their amazing boxing, and then you have Alex Pereira with the kickboxing, and you have the Khamzat Chimaevs with the wrestling. I do feel like MMA is seeing that growth in the positive direction, which is a very good thing in general. So yeah, boxing, the higher skill fights for sure. But one thing the UFC does is it's definitely far more entertaining. And I'm saying this as a boxing fan, but we just had Mason Jones versus Axel Sola at the London card, and that was you barely get fights like that in boxing, whereas in the UFC you get gosh, what's his name? It's Iwan. I forgot how you say his last name, but he was on that London card as well, and he had that crazy 1 minute scrap as well. And just honestly, man, there's nobody in boxing like Yuri Prohaska. There's no boxing match like a Yuri versus Khalil or a Yuri versus Glover Teixeira. These fights are just so much more entertaining. Khamzat Chimaev, Sean Strickland, I already said, has a potential to be a bummer, but I think it has a potential to also be a crazy, crazy fight, which is crazy to say, I know, because Sean Strickland is Sean Strickland. People kind of view him as being not that entertaining, and Khamzat Chimaev had a pretty boring performance against DDP. But if Khamzat Chimaev's Sean Strickland's takedown defense stands up and the fight's on the feet, it gets real interesting, right? We did have MVP versus Sam Patterson, which was a complete dull fest as well. So it's not like everything's perfect. Max Holloway, Charles Oliveira. But if you look at Canelo Alvarez versus Terrence Crawford, this was considered a pretty fun fight by boxing fans. But if this were to happen in MMA, it would be like a relatively like lower mid fight, because we're so used to the Mason Jones and Axel Solas. We're used to the Yuri Prohaska carnages and the Ilia Topuria knockouts, and it is just a much more entertaining sport when you have guys who are throwing knees and elbows and takedowns and submissions. It is really just a lot more entertaining than boxing, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. Now we move on to really the last few things. One of the things boxing definitely does better is higher pay for the top stars. This really doesn't make a much difference to the fans, but I thought I would mention it because I think people would comment on it. If you look at, for example, Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury, Usyk was guaranteed over $100 million, while Fury was probably going to make somewhere in a very close ball range of that. Then you have Islam Makhachev, who made about $3 million. Now, keep in mind the Makhachev one isn't official; it's just going off of what we can assume. It could be more, it could be even less, which would be a bit crazy. But Makhachev is a very big name, and if this fight with JDM were to happen in boxing, he would have made a guaranteed 30-40 million, which is what the UFC were offering John Jones against Tom Aspinall. If a fight at the caliber of John Jones, Tom Aspinall were to happen in boxing, I think it'd be bigger than Usyk Fury, and that those guys both made guaranteed 100 million and like a guaranteed 80 million or whatever for Fury. So it really does go to show you that boxing at the highest level, the pay is very different. Guys like Makhachev, I think guys like Topuria, they're making somewhere between 2 to 5 million. At the very most, you can say maybe 10 million at the very most. Whereas boxing, the guys at most are making what's Canelo making, 150 million? And it's not like they're more relevant. I mean, maybe Canelo's a huge pay-per-view star and everything like that, but Usyk Fury are big names, but are they bigger than like a Makhachev Topuria in general? So they might be, but 100 million more? I don't know. Conor Benn got 15 million for Zuffa Boxing. Most people have never even heard of him. I know him because I like boxing, but he's not the superstar that Makhachev or a Topuria or even an Aspinall is. And so one can't deny the fact that when people talk about fighter pay, I'm going to explain in a second why they're mainly talking about the top stars. When it comes to fighter pay, I think the top stars compared to the top stars in boxing aren't making anywhere near as much. But one thing the UFC does better is that the pay for the lesser known stars is a lot better than boxing. That's one thing nobody really wants to mention. But in the UFC, now that we're in the Paramount era, you have a potential. Here's your potential, right? 100K performance bonus and 100K fight of the night bonus. Is it rare to get kind of both? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. Then you get the 25K finishing bonus that they added. And you have your show win pay, which leads to a total of about $225,000 plus. That's what you can make potentially as somebody with 5 followers on Instagram who nobody's ever heard of. You have the potential of making 225K. Mason Jones, or 225K plus. Mason Jones and Axel Solo, one of the best fights I've seen in a very long time. They both got 100K for that. In boxing, there is nothing like that. It's not like, oh, you just had a crazy performance. Here's 100K, and you also had fight of the night. Here's another 100K. There is none of that. When you're a lesser-known boxer fighting on the undercards, you're fighting for like 5, 10K. Some of them are fighting for a hot dog and the front row tickets, right? Like, there's not that much. Whereas with UFC fighters, I've always said that if you're a no-name fighter, you have the potential to make so much more money as a no-name fighter in the UFC than in boxing. In boxing, the ceiling as far as what you could potentially make is so much higher than the UFC because you could potentially be making as much as a Canelo or a Crawford or an Usyk or a Fury. But in MMA in general, you watch Embedded and these guys are staying at these crazy nice, not hotels, but Airbnbs and stuff. It's not like it came out of nowhere. As mid-level fighters and lower-level fighters, I don't think the pay, I'm not going to say bad or good in general. I'm going to compare it to boxing. It's a lot better. Where boxing succeeds is where we get to the higher names. It's where the big names should be getting paid as much as they draw. And in the UFC, they often aren't, which is a big issue. But even in boxing, like a Vasyl Lomachenko, when he fought, I believe, or was it Triple G? I think it was Triple G. He got, I think, around $2 million for his fight in Madison Square Garden, I think it was, which is about what Makhachev made. But the difference is, I think the Makhachev fight was a lot bigger, and it drew a bigger house and a bigger pay-per-view buys, and yet Makhachev got paid roughly the same as Triple G, which, that's not right. Like, the top stars should be getting paid a lot more, let's be honest. As far as what they bring in, I know there's a crazy statistic that UFC pays like 17% of what they make to the actual fighters. But when people have this very romantic view of boxing pay, I think they're really thinking about the top guys like Usyk and Fury. They're not thinking about the smaller guys, because the smaller guys are not. There's not a potential for 225K plus. There just isn't. There's a potential for about 5 to 10K, maybe 15K, but there's a much bigger potential overall compared to the UFC. So yeah, I'm gonna end it there. Those are just me looking at some stuff as a boxing fan and as a UFC fan. I wanted to kind of compare where I think UFC shines. I think they are just more entertaining in general. The fights are a lot more entertaining. Um, Boxing has a lot higher skill, because how did Marvin Vettori ever fight for a belt? I will never understand. That was a free give me for Israel Adesanya, and he beat Paulo Costa, who was also a title contender. So I don't know. UFC has got better pacing, and boxing, the bigger fights are made. UFC, we did have Michael Bisping versus Dan Henderson. It wasn't like the best fight, the best was always happening, but that was like on a rare occasion, and the story was behind it was that Bisping was obviously very badly knocked out by Dan Henderson, one of the most iconic knockouts of all time, and he was looking to get revenge, right? So, but in general, the UFC, the best, the biggest and the best fights are made. But recently, it feels like that's not been the case. Whereas boxing is continuously building, like Junta Nakatani Inoue. If you know, you know. That's the fight I'm looking forward to the most in the year. Like, if you know, you know, that's gonna be a crazy banger of a fight. UFC, it feels like, man, we could have gotten Makhachev Tupuri at the White House and we didn't. And now the UFC's teasing Volkanovski Silva over Volkanovski Evloev. So it's all pretty insane. But yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna end it there. I'm rambling now. So tell me what you guys think. What do you think boxing does better than the UFC? What do you think UFC does better than boxing? Vice versa, whatever it is. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.